or how a poem begins, or how a poem ends. I'm going to be talking about living as a poet, about being a poet in the world. And as many of you know, I live in Greece. I've lived in Greece since 1999. I studied classics in Athens, Georgia, so perhaps I was always headed to Athens one way or another. To seal the deal, I married a Greek man. Then there was no going back. And it's been a very fascinating time to be in Greece, starting in 2008 with the very dramatic economic crisis. And that kind of went seamlessly into very large influx of refugees from war-torn Syria and also Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, all kinds of places that were coming into Greece. And somehow I ended up very involved in that. So now a good portion of my life is spent interacting either as a volunteer with refugees at a squat in central Athens, where I help coordinate activities with children, and I also run a poetry workshop at the Melissa Network for Migrant Women. And that's been a very interesting experience because most of these women don't have very much English. Our group is almost entirely Persian speaking, so Farsi and Dari, women from Iran and Afghanistan. And it's been a very different kind of workshop, as you can imagine. So although we don't have a language in common, Persian is a language of poetry. I mean, poetry is really respected and honored and really part of the language. So they have a lot to teach me. And there is no lack of material. It's not like there's this workshop where people don't have things to write about. Like we walked out of the Taliban. But it has changed my relationship towards the classics and classical literature and how I read things like the Iliad. So I'm going to sort of frame this with some small passages out of the Iliad. And I was reading through some of the Iliad, and suddenly I was really struck by this passage, and it's the first passage in your handout. And basically Achilles, you all remember, what is the Iliad about? It's the wrath of Achilles, right. The wrath of Achilles, the plights and gripes of Achilles, as Berriman would have it. But why is he mad? Because they took his girl. That's right. They took his girl, and they offer him another girl in return, and that is not good enough. And so he's been sulking for a while now. And Ajax, Odysseus, and Phoenix go to his tent, and they're going to offer him 7 girls now. 7 girls from the island of Lesbos. And they come across him. They came to the huts and ships of the Myrmidons and found him delighting his heart with the clear-sounding forminx. A forminx is an early lyre. That's a forminx. Fine and intricately wrought, and which had a bridge of silver. This he had taken as booty when he had laid waste the city of Eetion, and with it he pleased his spirit, singing of the famous deeds of men. This increasingly strikes me as an interesting passage for several reasons. For one thing, we have what is called in classical literature an object biography. So in the days before mass-produced things, when you got something from Walmart, every object that you used was made by hand. It was made by a human being. It was unique. And so every time you get an object in the Iliad or the Odyssey, there's a little break where it says, so-and-so made this, or this is the history of this particular object. And I think we don't really care where this came from. But in a different society where everything is made by hand, that is sort of part of the conversation of where did you get this and who made it. We don't find out who made it. What we find out is that Achilles has taken it as booty when he laid waste the city of Eetion. So this is a lyre and I think about lyric poetry, I think we think of lyric poetry as a poetry largely of peace and of individuality, of speaking of I in the first person. But this is something that has been taken out of a raised city, a city that has been razed to the ground. So whoever did own this lyre is probably now dead and killed probably by Achilles, the same fingers that are playing the lyre. We find out what he is singing. He is singing of the famous deeds of men. What are the famous deeds of men? Killing. So he is almost certainly singing about raising a city, perhaps the city of Eetion. This is a kind of humble-looking forminx, but the forminx that he is playing is intricately wrought. It is beautiful, and it has a bridge of silver. It is an aristocratic instrument, perhaps belonging to an aristocrat, perhaps belonging to the king of the city, perhaps belonging to Eetion. One of the things when you're reading classical literature, you tend to skip over these names. You know, it's just like metrical filler to fill out the dactylic hexameter, place names and people names. But I think one of the things living in Greece and living in close proximity to these places, I more and more am looking at them and looking on the map and looking about what this might mean. So it's interesting because in the Odyssey, there are lots of lyres and liars, liars and liars. And there you see lots of times where there's a bard singing to the forminx at the feast. This is often. But in the Iliad, this is the only case of a real person singing to a lyre. You see Apollo with the lyre, you know, he's a god. And there are images of people singing on the lyre in the Shield of Achilles. But in the world of the Iliad, only Achilles is shown as performing as a bard, and he's performing something that might be a little bit like the Iliad. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in who gets to be a lyric poet. And he is playing not to an audience. The only person who is with him is his friend Patroclus, who is listening at a distance, but he seems to be playing to delight his own heart. So it seems to be a poet, talking about the poetry of loneliness. It's about being alone and delighting his own heart with these memories. So I became very interested in this, and I started looking out for whenever I would come across the name Eetion. In a latter part of this same, the embassy to Achilles, he is explaining why he is so furious and why he doesn't want these 7 girls. The 7 girls are from the island of Lesbos, which he has also laid waste to. So the girl that he had, Briseis, is someone he took after laying waste to her city. The other girl, Chryseis, he laid waste to her city. The 7 girls who are in exchange from Lesbos, he is the one who destroyed Lesbos. These are all essentially sex slaves taken in war in an area of the world not very far from where ISIS is doing that right now, laying waste to cities and taking women for sex slaves and bartering and selling them. So this is something not, to me, in the distant past. There's another point when he's talking about how angry he is, and this is a little bit of fancy Greek there in the middle of the page. I'm not sure I'm going to read that, but I was interested in how this gets translated because metanastin, which is the word I've bolded, in modern Greek, metanastis is a word you hear all of the time. It is in graffiti, it is all over the news, and it means immigrant or migrant. It's interesting how it is translated by various translators. So I'm giving you sort of a Stanley Lombardo, but I swell with rage when I think of how the son of Atreus, that's Agamemnon, treated me like dirt in public as if I were some worthless tramp. Okay? Fitzgerald. And yet my heart grows large and hot with fury remembering that affair as though I were some riffraff or camp follower. He taunted me before them all. Yet still the heart in me swells up in anger when I remember the disgrace he wrought upon me before the Argives, the son of Atreus, as if I were some dishonored vagabond. Interesting. Carolyn Alexander also picks up on vagabond. It's one of the perils of translation, of whether you're being influenced by other translations, although I like her translation a lot. But my heart swells with rage when I recall these things, how in the presence of the Argives he degraded me, the son of Atreus, as if I were some worthless vagabond. So it's quite interesting that there's this idea of tramps, vagabond, riffraff. But that's not really, even if you look it up in Little and Scott, that is not the definition that you get. And it's interesting that this, the E.V. Rue, and I don't know whether this is to do with how it was revised or whether it's in the original. It was the first Penguin Classics that was published, I think it's in 1950. And it's done in prose. But my heart swells with anger when I think of what happened and the disgraceful way in which Agamemnon treated me in public like some refugee who counted for nothing. I think that that is probably the closest to how I would read it. The idea is not that he is a tramp or a beggar or a nobody, and this word doesn't appear at all in the Odyssey, for instance, when Odysseus is dressed up as a beggar. He is not a metanastes, he's a beggar. But it has to do with whether he is a citizen and has certain rights, and he is being treated like someone who does not have any rights. And I found that a very interesting point. Also, whenever he uses it twice, this phrase, and both times he uses it speaking to someone who is themselves not quite a citizen, whether it's Phoenix, who had to move after a murder, or it is after a potential murder, or it is Patroclus, who himself had to move after a murder and became in exile. It's interesting that George Chapman in 1611, I think, understands this sense very well. But still, as often as I think how rudely I was used and like a stranger for all rights fit for our good refused, my heart doth swell against the man that durst be so profane. This is a Chapman of Keats looking into Chapman fame. And I think he's got it on the nose. He does not use the word refugee, and that is because the word refugee does not exist in English in 1611. The word refugee comes in at a very specific moment, if I can find it in my book. And it comes in with the Huguenots into English. Where is it? It comes in at a very specific point, and it particularly means people who are compelled to leave, who are fleeing for their lives. And that is its meaning for a fair amount of time. There are certain points where the word refugee in English kinds of adjusts, and you can see refugee is not an English word, it's a Frenchy sounding word. And if you think about, do we have a native word for refugee in English? I don't know. Outcast, stranger, none of these things, and strangers, not an English word either. We don't really have something in the language, so we had to import. Refugee had to cross the border with the Huguenots. And there's a second point where that word gets adjusted, and that is in Flanders in 1914. And you have, I'm trying to find my, you have, again, a very specific moment. You have Germans taking over and people fleeing, 1.5 million people, going largely into England, but also into other countries surrounding. And this time, refugee has a slightly different feeling to it. Refugee means not just someone who has left, but someone who is fleeing from their lives and seeking refuge somewhere else. And that is a lot closer to our sense. So this is between August and October in 1914. And suddenly there are these waves of desperate people. We have interesting witnesses to that. One of the witnesses to this flood of refugees is Rupert Brooke, the poet that we know mostly, I think, for the sonnet, The Soldier, if I should die, think only this of me, there is a corner of a foreign field that is forever England. And he gets flack, I think, maybe that's not the right word, some flack for that poem as romanticizing war and being a bit jingoistic. In fact, the poem was used that way. It's used that way by Churchill, among other people. But it was originally titled The Recruit. And I think we have to keep in mind that it's idealism. There is a bit of irony if you keep the original title, The Recruit. And we often say, oh, Brooke didn't see action. But he saw something which maybe is just as bad as action, which is the aftermath. What happens when a city falls? What happens when Troy falls? What happens when a city falls? On Sunday, 27th of September, Brooke joined his battalion, which was camped on the coast of Kent. A week later, on 4th October, they marched to Dover and embarked to defend Antwerp from the German advance. In the next 5 days, Antwerp fell. Brooke and his company had to march 25 miles in the retreat through a landscape wasted by shelling, by pools of burning petrol from a bombed fuel depot. Round them, the carcasses of horses and cattle sizzled, and wagons of dead, wounded, and refugees filled the roads. Brooke wrote, "I saw what was a truer hell. Thousands of refugees, their goods on barrows and handcarts and perambulators and wagons, moving with infinite slowness out into the night, 2 unending lines of them, the old men mostly weeping, the women with hard-drawn faces, the children playing or crying or sleeping. The eyes grow clearer and the heart, but it's a bloody thing, half the youth of Europe, blown through pain to nothingness in the incessant mechanical slaughter of these modern battles." So I don't think that this is a poet who has a romantic view of war when he is writing The Soldier. Another writer who became very involved in this particular refugee situation was Edith Wharton. She essentially quit writing for a couple of years and just managed a refugee. She managed a house for refugees, the American hostels for refugees in Paris, and she writes a lot about seeing the refugees and experiencing these people. She has this wonderful story. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Last year, among the waifs swept to Paris by the great torrent of the flight from the north, there came to the American hostels a little acrobat from a strolling circus. He was not much more than a boy, and he had never before been separated from his family or from his circus. All his people were mummers or contortionists, and he himself was a mere mote of the limelight, knowing life only in terms of the tent and the platform, the big drum, the dancing dogs, the tightrope, and the spangles. In the sad, preoccupied Paris of last winter, it was not easy to find a corner for this little figure, but the lad couldn't be left in the streets. And after a while, he was placed as page in a big hotel. He was given good pay and put into good livery and told to be a good boy. He tried, he really tried. But the life was too lonely. Nobody knew anything about the only things he knew and was particularly interested in the program of the last performance the company had given of Les Jours Maubert. Sorry, I can't do the French. The little acrobat could not understand. He told his friends at the hostels how lonely and puzzled he was, and they tried to help him, but he couldn't sleep at night because he was used to being up till nearly daylight. And one night he went up to the attic of the hotel, broke open several trunks full of valuables stored there by rich lodgers, and made off with some of the contents. He was caught, of course, and the things he had stolen were produced in court. They were the spangled dresses belonging to a Turkish family and the embroidered coats of a lady's lapdog. I have told this poor little story to illustrate a fact which, as time passes, is beginning to be lost sight of, the fact that we workers among the refugees are trying first and foremost to help a homesick people. We are not preparing for their new life an army of voluntary colonists. We are seeking to console for the ruin of their old life a throng of bewildered fugitives. It is our business not only to feed and clothe and keep alive these people, but to reassure and guide them. I like that image because it's this idea of people being individuals. Here's this little kid who was from the circus, and all he knew was sparkly clothing, and he couldn't fit into this new life. The other thing that she did, she made an anthology. She had all of these very famous friends, and she said, what we need, I think some of us have been involved in things like this, what we need is a big anthology about the refugees. I don't know whether it's maybe one of the first political anthologies of that kind. I'm sure probably it isn't. So it was called The Book of the Homeless. In 1916, it was sold for the benefit of the American hostels for refugee children of the Flanders Rescue Rescue Committee. She got Theodore Roosevelt to write the introduction. That the part that America has played in this great tragedy is not an exalted part. We owe to Mrs. Wharton all the assistance we can give. We owe this assistance to the good name of America, and above all, for the cause of humanity, we owe it to the children, the women, and the old men who have suffered such dreadful wrong for absolutely no fault of theirs. Just saying. And she had all of these famous friends. So Sarah Bernhardt is a contributor, Rupert Brooke, Jean Cocteau, Joseph Conrad, Thomas Hardy, Henry James, George Santayana, Igor Stravinsky, Yeats. She also got artists, Renoir, Rodin, John Singer Sargent, Claude Monet. So I'd love to see a physical copy of this book. So it's kind of an amazing book in and of itself. I don't know how much money it made or what good it did, but it's an interesting artifact. William Butler Yeats's contribution, by the way, is the poem On Being Asked for, a war poem. I think it better that in times like these a poet's mouth be silent, for in truth we have no gift to set a statesman right. He has had enough of meddling who can please a young girl in the indolence of her youth or an old man upon a winter's night. But it's interesting that he kind of refuses to contribute a poem by contributing a poem. So that's a kind of neat trick to do. Edith Wharton herself has a very nice kind of Hardy-esque ballad in there. I guess I didn't know much about her verse, where she is speaking to a refugee. My house is ill to find, she said, for it has no roof but the sky. The tongue is torn from the steeple head. The streets are foul with the slime of the dead, and all the rivers run poison red with the bodies drifting by. I said, is there none to come at your call and all this throng astray? They shot my husband against a wall. And my child, she said, too little to crawl, held up its hands to catch the ball when the gun muzzle turned its way. So quite moving, efficient ballad. It's actually, I think, better than Hardy's poem contribution in that. So this is the sort of second time that the word refugee in English acquires a different set of resonances. The third time would be, of course, World War II. And that, again, is a very maybe specific set of refugees, and mostly the Jews of Europe. There's a wonderful essay, a very small essay that was published in a rather obscure journal by Hannah Arendt, of the banality of evil, Hannah Arendt, and it's titled We Refugees. And this is starting to get back a little bit to the lyre and the lyric, because one of our things as lyric poets is to speak in the first person, that privilege maybe of being able to speak for yourself. But when refugees are viewed as a group, they have to speak as a chorus. And this is something you'll see in the Athenian plays, whether it's the suppliant women, when it's the Trojan women, that the people who have been evicted from a city become a we and an us and a they. So she titled it, We Refugees. In the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. We ourselves call each other newcomers or immigrants. If we are saved, we feel humiliated. And if we are helped, we feel degraded. I wonder what would happen if she would have met Edith Wharton in her do-gooding. A refugee used to be a person driven to seek refuge because of some act committed or some political opinion held. Well, it is true, we have had to seek refuge, but we committed no acts, and most of us never dreamt of having any radical opinion. With us, the meaning of the term refugee has changed. Now, refugees are those of us who have been so unfortunate as to arrive in a new country without means and have to be helped by refugee committees. It's kind of a funny essay. There's a lot of humor in it, but under the humor, there's a lot of anger. So it's this process, I think, whereby refugees become this sort of faceless mass of people. And you see that certainly in the Athenian plays, where they are often in the view of a chorus. In the Suppliant Women, which is ends up being a very interesting play right now. So you have 50 women who are coming over from the border between Syria and Egypt, and they cross the sea and they come to Greece to seek asylum. Asylum is a very good Greek word. It's very important in the corpus of Greek literature in all the plays. And it means that which cannot be seized, something unseizable. So asylum, once granted, cannot be taken. That's what asylum means. And they come seeking asylum. It's called usually the suppliant women, but you could translate it and just call it the asylum seekers, because that's what this is. And, they have to speak as a plural. This is the chorus. "Oh, this land, these hills of Appia, I call to you, for you well understand my words, the speech of those from foreign lands. Again and again I seize my veil, this linen veil from Sidon, and tear it into shreds." I was at a very interesting talk on the suppliant women, and the speaker, Jeff Bakewell, just very casually translated that Sidonian veil as hijab, which is a perfectly correct translation, and there was a sort of gasp of recognition from the audience. "If not, our dark and sunburnt faces will move with suppliant's branches onto Zeus, Lord of earth, who welcome all the dead. For if Olympian gods deny our prayers, we will seek death and die by the rope." The king, Pelasgus, finds the women's dress alien and foreign, and he's suspicious of their culture. "From what place do you, group of women, come?" Maybe go back where you came from. "This clothing is not Greek. The robes you wear are thickly woven and luxurious, a foreign style. Who am I speaking to? Your garments are not those of Greek girls. They don't come from any part of Greece. I am amazed that you are brave enough to dare approach this place without a herald or a guide or someone to protect you. I see those branches lying there beside you, the usual emblem of suppliant to the divinities who gather here. But that is all a native Greek could know. In many other matters, I can make a reasonable guess, but you are here. You can tell me what I wish to learn." And he, again, "As I listen to your words, you strangers, I find your story quite beyond belief." It's one of these things that the refugee has to tell their story over and over again, and to tell the worst parts of their story. And so you say, if you're a woman and you come from some area and you've been raped or whatever, you're going to have to relive that in detail at every asylum interview. "For an appearance, you are far more like the women in Libya and not at all like the women in this land. The River Nile might have produced a racial group like yours. Your features look just like those images of females cast by Cyprian craftsmen, or like those nomad women I hear who ride on saddled camels instead of horses." And this idea, this foreign set of people is going to come in on camels. This is a very ancient kind of set of cliches. And reading these plays, the women generally go from speaking in I to speaking in we. Even reading what qualifies for refugee qualification, suddenly to me, I guess as a poet, almost seems a little bit like a poem. "To be eligible," this is to be a refugee, "you must be outside the country you are from, and you must be unable or unwilling to return to the country you are from, because you have a well-founded fear. You must be afraid, and there must be objective evidence from your country, newspaper articles, NGO reports, UN reports, that show you have a good reason to be afraid. That if you return to your country, you will be persecuted, e.g., there is a threat to your life, freedom, or other human rights, based on one or more of the following reasons: your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, your membership of a particular social group." This idea that, to be a refugee is to be afraid. You must be very, very afraid, and you must demonstrate how afraid that you are. So, to a certain degree, living in Greece and the Eastern Aegean and dealing with people who have fled because they are afraid and who have crossed that very dangerous crossing where hundreds of people drown, has made some of these plays feel a little bit almost too close to home. And I've been reading things in a kind of different sort of way. So one of the things is, again, reading back through the Aeneid, which begins with refugees. This is after the fall of Troy. What is Aeneas but a refugee? I was translating the opening of the Aeneid, and he is fato profugos. He is expelled by fate, and I translated profugos as refugee. In fact, the modern Greek for refugee is prosphigas. The modern Italian for refugee is profugo. And the editor quibbled with me and said, I don't think that's right. And I said, I think it is exactly right. Just because people didn't always have access to this word does not mean that it is not the correct translation. And if you go and look in an Italian newspaper, that's what profugo means. It means a refugee. So reading things in this different way, going back into the Iliad, and so chilling. The Iliad is very aware of what's going to happen. You can't have spoilers in the Iliad. Everyone who hears the Iliad already knows that Troy is going to fall and in what order people are going to die and what's going to happen to them. So there's always this foreshadowing. So it turns out that before this embassy to Achilles, in Book 6, there's one of the most tender and beautiful moments in the Iliad, heart-wrenching. And Hector, the greatest fighter of the Trojans, is coming home from war to visit with his wife and his little baby son. There's a beautiful family portrait. The baby son is scared of the horsehair on his helmet and cries, and he has to take it off. And he and his wife Andromache laugh about it. Very, very tender scene, but obviously made more tender when we realize Hector is going to die, the baby is going to die, and Andromache is going to be sold as a sex slave. But there are these wonderful arias. Generally, women don't speak very much in the Iliad. There's a new novel, which I have not read and perhaps covers exactly what I'm saying, called The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. I don't know if people have read that, but it's all about women speaking in the Iliad, because there are some characters. Helen speaks a little bit. Hecuba, the mother of Hector, speaks a little bit. But the main woman who speaks is actually Andromache. Andromache, whose name means fights like a man. It's a very masculine name. And in Book 6, the same scene where we have the tender family, she pleads with him, do not die. She says, and when I lose you, I might as well be dead. There will be no comfort left when you have met your end, nothing but grief. And I have no father or lady mother either. My father, Aetion, fell to godlike Achilles when he sacked our welcoming town, Sicilian Thebe, with its high gate. But though Achilles killed Aetion, he did not think it right to strip the body. He cremated him in his ornate arms and built a grave mound above him. And the mountain nymphs, daughters of Zeus, who drive the storm clouds, planted elms around it. I had 7 brothers too at home. In one day, all of them went down to Hades. Godlike, swift-footed Achilles killed them all, while they were looking after their shambling cattle and white sheep. This is not a pitched battle. He's gone out into the countryside and just murdered people. This is just rampaging murder. As for my mother, who ruled Thebe under the woods of Mount Placus, Achilles brought her here with the rest of his spoils, but freed her for an immense ransom, and later she died peacefully in her father's house at the hands of Artemis, who delights in arrows. So her own mother was one of Achilles' women that he has seized in these towns. So Hector, you are father and mother and brother to me, as well as my strong husband. Have pity on me now. Stay here on the tower and don't make your boy an orphan and your wife a widow. I think it's one of the strongest love poems in literature. You are my father and my mother and my brothers. You are everything to me. And it's almost a lyric poem in itself and could be something that could have been sung to this beautiful instrument. It could have been, but it isn't. That's not what happens. There's another scene when Hector does finally die, and the name Aetion comes up again. As you can see, I just kept looking for where does Aetion show up. And it's when Andromache finds out that Hector has been killed. It's a really cinematic scene. Hecuba, Hector's mother, is preparing his bath so that he can come in and have a warm bath after the battle. And then they find out that he's died. Black night came down and engulfed Andromache's eyes. This is on page 3. She crashed backwards, fainting. The bright headdress flew far from her head, and with the headband, the cap, the woven braids, and the headscarf, the hijab, that golden Aphrodite had given her on the day when Hector of the flashing helmet, after giving an untold bride price, came to fetch her from her father Aetion's house. It's a very strong moment because once she is married, she's wearing this veil to, be modest and cover her beautiful hair for her husband. And at the moment he dies, that veil falls off and her hair is just naked on the ground. Hector, what unhappiness is mine? So you and I were born under the same star, you here in Priam's house, and I and Thebe under the woods of Mount Placus in the house of Aetion, who brought me up from childhood, the ill-fated father of a more ill-fated child. Even if he, she's talking about the child now, Astyanax, survives this war with all its tears. And what makes this also awful is that we know he's not going to survive. We know that Odysseus is going to toss him from the ramparts. Nothing remains for him but hardship and distress. Others will take over his lands. An orphan child, and here she describes an orphan child in a city of peace. This isn't an orphan child, what happens in war. And this is sad, but it's sad because this isn't even going to happen. An orphan child is cut off from his friends. He goes about with downcast eyes and tear-stained cheeks. Need drives him to his father's acquaintances, and he tugs a cloak here and a tunic there until someone out of pity holds up a wine cup briefly to his mouth, just enough to wet his lips but not to drink. Then comes another boy with both parents living who drives him from the feast, punching him and jeering at him. Go on, get out. You've got no father dining here. So the child runs off in tears to his widowed mother, the little Astyanax, who used to sit on his father's knee and eat nothing but marrow and mutton fat, and when he was drowsy and tired of play, slept in his bed, softly cradled in his nurse's arms, heart full of contentment. If you look at the back, you'll see there's a map. my beautiful hand-drawn map. So you can see where Troy is up at the top. Thebe is the town where Andromache is from and which Achilles sacks. He also sacks Lyrnessus and 12 towns in this area, 11 by land and 12 by sea. He also sacks Lesbos. So he is bored at Troy and he just goes around and basically destroys every town within a day's ride of Troy. You'll remember the two girls that were fought over at the beginning. Briseis and Chryseis. Chryseis is also from Thebe, where Andromache is from. So he didn't just get the lyre of Aetion. That's where he got Thebe from. That's where Chryseis is from, and Briseis is from Lyrnessus, just below here. So all of these girls were sort of taken at the same time, and they would have been girls Andromache would have kind of grown up with. These are all kind of people of an age and who would know each other. So there's this moment when Patroclus dies, and I don't know if I have that on here too. Yeah. And Briseis, is mourning, but it's a very peculiar kind of mourning. She's mourning Patroclus, who is the one guy who's nice to her, but it's a very odd thing to say, what she says. Oh, Patroclus, my heart's delight, oh, my misery, I left you in this hut alive when I went away, and now I've come back, commander of men, to find you dead. Such is my life, an endless chain of disaster. I saw the husband to whom my father and my lady mother gave me mangled in front of his town by the cruel spear. I saw my 3 brothers, my dear brothers born by the same mother as myself, all meet their doom. But you, when swift-footed Achilles killed my husband and sacked my lord Minos' town, you would not even let me weep. You said you would make me Achilles' lawful wife and take me in your ships to your home in Phthia and give me a wedding feast among the Myrmidons. You were always so gentle with me. So in death I mourn you inconsolably. It's a very strange way of mourning, and you're remembering that Achilles, your friend, has killed my father and all of my brothers. Then there's one of the strangest lines in the Iliad. And so she spoke in tears, and the other women took up their cry. Each one recalled through Patroclus her own misfortunes. I'm not wild about that translation. Thus Briseis and the women mourned with her for Patroclus, yes, but each woman also for her own private sorrows. She wailed again, and women sobbed about her for Patroclus, then each for each one's grief. Thus she grieved, and the women joined in her wailing for Patroclus, and each one wept for her own private sorrows. Chapman is actually, I think, closest to the Greek. Thus spake she weeping, and with her did the other ladies moan Patroclus' fortunes in pretext, but in sad truth their own. And this idea of being a chorus and performing this public mourning, but being able to weep your private grief while you're doing that. And in these workshops that I'm doing at Melissa, it's interesting because someone will write something, say about their mother, and will start crying, and everyone will start crying. And it's exactly that. They're crying, in condolence, but everyone has their own reason to cry. I am going to, in a few seconds, run a little bit of a slideshow, which I hope will, show you some of the poems that the women are doing, and there are some other images, and Larry will tell me when that is ready to go. So again, the actual lyre of Aetion would be much fancier than this. It has a silver bridge. It would be very finely worked, but it would be shaped something like this. This is how all lyric poetry in the West starts with it. Here, again, we see where Andromache is from. These are some of the women in my poetry workshop. Some of their poems. In spring, I am a bird with sweet whistling. I am like a kite because I mean freedom. I am not like a kite. The string cuts my hand. I don't know what that says. We did moon questions. Why? When does the moon set? Why are you in Greece? Why are you so far? Who broke you? I am like the rain, because rain is the start of deep feeling, because it is clean sadness, because rain is filled. She ends, because I am the universe. Her name is Hashti. So I was like, am I translating this right? But it turns out Hashti means the universe. This is from 1922, Greeks coming back to Greece, or this is a graveyard on Lesbos. This is an unknown infant, 3 months old. Home, I miss my home, the color, roses. These are acrostics on the name Fatima. America is big in there. These were a list of things they said made home. I like that you needed a goldfish and kisses. This is a statue that was brought by refugees in 1922. It's called The Little Refugee. This is 2016 Piraeus, thousands of people walking off of a boat onto Greece. This is a modern Greek painter who shows refugees falling into a kind of geometric pot, which also shows drownings. This is the pot. Just the idea that drownings have been happening here. Even though Lesbos is only about 3 nautical miles from the coast of Turkey, that can be some very scary weather. Some of these are John's photos. I think this is John's. This is one of my girls, ladies, women. They were so excited. We got a donation of lipstick. They were very excited about the lipstick donation. This is a Valentine's poem. Our teachers and classmates are love. The smell of the food reminds me of the day of the war. In that time, the food was less. The smell of the garden reminds me of my childhood, and my children remind me of my mother. These are people happily arriving onto Lesbos safely. John took this picture of life jackets on the shore. This boat set out from Edgermont. It set out from exactly where Andromache is from. This is the last time any of these people were seen alive. And this is Safety by Zara. Still afraid for everything? Trust yourself.